Welcome to part two of the progressive era. In the last class, we discussed some of the changes and reactions to the industrial era and how this prompted the progressive movement. In this lecture, we're going to discuss how progressives sought to regulate, reform, and improve aspects of society by using the government as a vehicle or tool in that progressive change. So today's class will focus on one major question. How did progressivism change America's view of the proper role of government? In the last class, we discussed progressives who were discontent with the idea that the world was beyond their control and their ability to improve or shape. They refuted ideas like social Darwinism and instead believed that they could change positively society. We also discussed how the muckrakers started to expose many of the inequities of society, whether it comes to business abuse or poor working conditions, the problems with crime and poverty. As urban reformers like Jane Addams at the Hull House began working on these social issues, trying to reform and improve society, they ran into the problem that many of these issues were much larger than just the local community. So it became very difficult for urban reformers to enact the change they wanted to these very systemic social problems. And what became clear is that a larger force needed to be used in reforming and regulating society beyond that than just the community patrol. So progressives started to look more and more towards the government, the federal government and state governments as an answer to this challenge. Progressives envisioned a more active role of government in this more intricate and impersonal industrial world. Now, just for a note on American ideals concerning government traditionally, is that America, for a long time prior to the industrial era, had subscribed to a classical Republican outlook of the world, and that the real true idea was, or the central question was, how do you promote individual liberty and freedom? And for the history of the United States until this period, the answer to that was less government intervention, and more powerful government at the local levels, and then going up to the state and then the federal. So the idea was is that if you wanted to live your best life, the best way to do that was for you to be in the most control of it, have government at the least involved, particularly at the federal level. And if government was part of your life, it really needed to be in a place where you could be a participant in that, in the local or state government. But the industrial world started to change many of the ideas about the way the world worked. And one of those ideas that started to evolve and change was the perspective on the role of government. Here's Theodore Roosevelt talking about the limitation of government power. He said, "There once was a time in history when the limitation of governmental power meant increasing liberty for the people." This is the point I was trying to make, is that there was a time where less government equaled more freedom. In the present day, the limitation of governmental power, of governmental action, means the enslavement of the people by great corporations who can only be held in check through the extension of governmental power. So you can see Teddy Roosevelt is advocating for a different type of vision about what the government's role in society was. And he is saying that the government in this world has to become the big advocate for the people in many ways to protect them from these large forces of that are changing in society related to industrialism and this new era of capitalism. But before the government could be used to implement, and remember the goals of the progressives, and think about this when it comes to the government itself and what they would like to do, is their idea is that we can regulate, we can end abuse in society, or at least limit it. We can improve institutions in our society, whether that be the institution of public education, whether that be revamping how some of local government works. But you can take these broken institutions and improve them or reform them, excuse me. And then the other idea is that you can look ahead and improve society. Well, the idea becomes is that the government could be a very helpful tool in this process. But before that could take place, there really needed to be a repair of the tool itself. We talked about some of the problems that were facing the American Republic and local governments at the time, whether that be the giant influence that businesses and trusts had in Washington, D.C., or the corruption that pervaded city elections with political machines like Boss Tweed. So before the government can be used as an active tool and a helpful tool, it became important for the progressives to actually reform the government itself. So this is where I talk about, you start to think about the government being a tool in the toolbox of reformers. But that tool itself is broken at the moment and needs repair. But once it's repaired, it can be a very helpful tool in regulating, reforming, and improving society. Reformers saw the highly disciplined, organized, and class based style of machine politics as inherently corrupt and backwards. The sight of large numbers of poorly uneducated voters marching to the polls could only mean widespread manipulation and corruption. So, what they looked at is when they looked upon city elections and the Republican system, they saw what they believed were people taking advantage of it, whether that be stuffing the ballot box, or there's examples of this is that they would go often, some sort of politician or at least his cronies, the people working for him, would go into a pub and they would buy everybody a drink in the entire pub, and they say, if you come with us, right, and vote in this election for this person, we'll take you there, we'll have you vote, and we'll bring you back, and we'll buy you another drink. So does that truly represent the interest of the people, or people finding ways to manipulate the system? And there are still many current conversations going on in our society about this today. And right now, at this moment, as we are all kind of on this COVID lockdown, there are questions about the upcoming presidential election and the national election, the state elections, and how they would be conducted if we were unable to congregate in areas where lots of people were there. And so people have been asking whether we can mail in ballots, if this should be something that should be done on the internet. And again, a lot of people and their concerns and their reservations go to a manipulation of this political process. And this is what reformers saw, is they saw a government in many ways that had been hijacked by personal interest, by business interest, and it was important for them to take back this tool and so they could use it in their reform measures. So there were several efforts, direct efforts of the progressives to fix the broken tool. And what does fixing the broken tool mean? I really think there's two concepts that we need to highlight. One is making the government more accountable to the people themselves, and that is more reflective of their will, right? So that when politicians are elected, that they are going and doing the business of the people and the public good, rather than representing their personal interests or interests of a very influential business in their district. So, the first element of fixing the broken tool is to make government more accountable to the people. The second element of the progressive reforms was to make the government more transparent and to make sure that we could keep an eye on the way politicians were working to make sure it was in an effort for that public good. So you see several reforms come about. Two important reforms in state and local governments was the institution of the Australian ballot, the secret ballot, and voter registration. And what this tried to combat was, and what these two reforms or changes tried to combat was political corruption in the voting process. Just think back to our earlier discussions on Reconstruction and the implementation of the 14th and 15th Amendments, which extended suffrage to African Americans. If you look at this political cartoon right here, these people are voting, and when they are voting, they're voting in public. Is that you go in and you put your ballot in a specific party bucket. And so everybody can see who you're voting for, and if your boss is there or your neighbor is there and they have differing political interests, that could lead to difficult social circumstances later on. And we saw that political influence, that one of the things that we saw even going back into Reconstruction was how people tried to influence the voting process. And this is largely because, or one of the reasons that this was available is because that voting process was so public. So it's a change like the secret ballot, the Australian ballot, is a reform to the voting process that can make the system more reflective of the people's will. Rather than voting in fear that someone would know what you supported or punish you socially, or maybe not invite you to a local dinner or whisper at you at the local church because of your politics, the secret ballot is an effort by the progressives to make the government more reflective of the people's popular will. Voter registration was another effort for progressives to reform this tool. Let's think about this. The government is this institution that could be used to improve society, but it needs to be regulated, reformed, and improved before it can do that. So by instituting things like voter registration, you can make this system cleaner. And that is, the idea was that voter registration was meant to try to make sure that people who were in the voting process were engaged in politics in a way where they just weren't being manipulated by outside forces, but instead were making a vote based on thoughtful and informed decisions to their location. Another element to make this government, to fix this tool, and to make it more accountable to the people was the introduction of the referendum. Referendums are when we vote on laws directly by the people. You'll see this occasionally in election years where most of the time laws are not voted on by the people themselves. We elect people to go to either Raleigh or to Washington, D.C., and those people then vote on laws. But the referendum is the introduction of an element that is trying to make the society more democratic and more respectful of the people's overall will. So, every now and then, when you go to vote in November, you will have a law and it will say, do you want this law passed or not? That is a direct vote. It is making our enhancing direct participation. So the idea is, what if you elected people and these people were resistant to popular ideas in society? right? And one of those that you have seen pass throughout the United States in several states is that the legalization of recreational marijuana has been turned directly to the people. So they said, look, this is a issue in society where it seems like these representatives are not really reflective of what the overall public sentiment was. So, if we have a referendum, we can really gauge our governmental decision on popular will. So, in some ways, you could see the referendum as taking power away from people that had tremendous influence and giving power more to the lower levels of regular people in society, a popular element. The recall was another important reform that was made to local governments, and that is the idea: what happens if you elect a politician and he or she goes off the rails? They take your society in a different direction than they promised when you elected them, right? So if you elected somebody, they win an election based on these principles, but then when they get into office, they take a hard right and really start to introduce things that just were not part of the original bargain. They instituted, this is a kind of a checks and balance, a safety measure for what happens when politicians go awry. And the answer to this, the recall, what it does is allows a second vote to where you can have a vote to remove a politician from office. The most recent example that I can remember of this is, I believe they tried to do this to the governor of Wisconsin about 8 years ago. It was not successful, but it was an example of how when a politician stops, or in the people's minds, stops representing their interests, is there anything you can do about it? And this is a regulation reform element right there, that clearly has a progressive vein to it. The last change, or one of the last elements that I want you to be familiar with, is the introduction of the 17th Amendment. The introduction of the 17th Amendment is a great example of progressive reforms in trying to make the government more accountable to the people on the federal level. For so many years, and prior to the 17th Amendment, senators had not been directly elected by the people. They would instead elect their their state legislature. So they would vote on the House of Representatives for, say, North Carolina. Then the House of Representatives would put forward some names, and they would vote on members from the House to go and become federal senators, national senators. So what the 17th Amendment does is it reforms this process, and instead now the 17th Amendment makes it so that the people of North Carolina directly vote for who their senators will be in Washington, D.C. So what this, again, I think you can see is a direct line to the people, and an idea that we're trying to get government to be more reflective of the people's will rather than the will of people in power. So let's kind of just close this part of the discussion with this question: what were the goals of these reforms? Right? Well, to answer that question, we start to think about some of the challenges that reformers had in society and how they were unable to overcome some of these challenges just because they were not big enough to address some of these factors, right? Is that these factors extended beyond Greenville, North Carolina. They extended beyond what the legislature, even in Raleigh, could do for North Carolinians. And so the goal of these reforms was to fix the broken tool. And that is the vision of government being a tool that could be used to improve society was there. But before it could be done, it needed to be reformed itself in a way that made it more transparent and accountable to the will of the American people. And it was changes like the Australian ballot and the 17th Amendment and the referendum that reformers were able to institute that really enacted this moment to where we will see the possibility of progressive legislation. And that's where we're going to turn next, is now that the progressive tool has been fixed, or at least has been repaired for the time being, how can we then take that tool to make the changes in society that progressives hope for? As progressivism gained momentum, you started to see progressive politicians infiltrate politics, right? At the local, state, and national level. People like Fighting Bob La Follette, or even moving up more popularly at the national level, we got progressive presidents like Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. And both of these individuals, these are great examples of people now in this popular vision of how government can be used as a tool to improve society. One of the platforms that Woodrow Wilson ran on was Vote for 8-Hour Wilson, showing that he was committed to one of the issues in the industrial work world of these long, almost abusive hours and regulating the 8-hour work day, the 40-hour work week. We know a lot about Teddy Roosevelt as the trust busting president. One thing that's really interesting in relation to Teddy Roosevelt was the emergence of one progressive muckraker, Upton Sinclair, who wrote this book called The Jungle. It was a sort of it's a historical type fiction. It's a fictional work based on reality, and it had to do with a lot of the problems within the meatpacking industry. So this book is set in Chicago. The people that work at this factory are the main characters in this story. And this book popularized ideas that were or popularized some of the things that were common in the meatpacking industry. And if you look at this passage, I think you can see some of the issues related to consumer protections that were coming to light during the period. It said this: it was only when the whole ham was spoiled that it came to the Department of Lisbetta. Cut up 2,000 revolutions a minute flyers and mixed with a half a ton of other meat. No odor that was ever in the ham could make any difference. So what they're saying is they took this spoiled ham and they just threw it in with a bunch of good meat and mixed it in, and nobody would know. There was never the least attention paid to what was cut up for the sausage. There would come all the way back from Europe old sausage that had been rejected, and that was moldy and white. It would be dosed with borax and glycerin and dumped into the hoppers and made over and over for home consumption. There would be meat that had tumbled out on the floor in the dirt and sawdust where the workers had tramped and spit uncounted billions of consumption germs. There would be meat stored in great piles in rooms, and water from leaky roofs would drip over it, and thousands of rats would race on it. It was too dark in these storage places to see well, but a man could run his hand over these piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of dried dung of rats. These rats were nuisances, and the packers would put poisoned bread out for them. They would die, and then the rats, the bread, the meat would all go into the hoppers. Continuing on, this is no fairy story and no joke. The meat would be shoveled into carts, and the man who did the shoveling would not trouble to lift a rat even when he saw one. There were things that went into the sausage in comparison, which a poisoned rat was just a tidbit. There was no place for men to wash their hands before they ate dinner, and so they made the practice of washing them in the water that was to be ladled into the sausage. There were butt ends of smoked meat and scraps of corned beef, and the odds and ends of waste of the plants would be dumped into old barrels in the cellar and left there. And they would so what these passages, I'd like for you to read this on your own too, is what these passages are talking about is how does a business make decisions, right? And a business doesn't make this if unregulated, or if there are no real um, ramifications that come back, um, they make decisions based on the bottom line. And so, how can you be sure that a restaurant in Greenville, North Carolina, is producing the food in a sanitary way? Well, you could say in the social Darwinist kind of world is that, well, restaurants that don't do this, right, that have poor sanitation practices will not thrive, right? People won't go to them because they see them as nasty. When people get sick, they won't. The people won't go back, and eventually, this business will go out of business, right? But in some ways, that is a long term look that sacrifices immediate problems for individuals. Think about this. What if you were a construction company and you could save $1 million by putting in some sort of watered down concrete? And this concrete you knew would not pose problems for 50 or 60 years. So you make this decision knowing that it could be a structural integrity issue later down the road. But you say, you know what, by that point, I've already made my money, I've already cashed out, I've retired, and more than likely, I've died at that point. Or on top of that, is how are they going to trace this and prove this back to me? So if you think of the social Darwinists would say, well, that business will just go out of business in the long term. Well, what about the people who bought those homes or the lives that were sacrificed in that process? What about the person that got food poisoning from the restaurant that was unregulated? So the jungle actually was one example of kind of the progressive muckrakers that brought to light actual legislation, because Teddy Roosevelt read this book and became kind of a man on fire, a progressive president that started really to use the federal government as a tool of regulation, reform, and improvement. And if we look at the legislation that occurs during this time, the Hepburn Act regulates railroad rates to prevent abuse among different businesses and passengers, to trying to take tries to take the Hepburn Act tries to reduce economic abuse in the railroad industry. The Meat Inspection Act requires federal inspection USDA approved meats. So they're going to go into places that are working with this and to make sure that there's a sanitary process. And look what the legacy of this legislation is at the state level, is that in the county level, is that we have the health department. So yearly, right, is that several times a year restaurants are inspected to make sure that they have safe practices. And when we go in, that certificate has to be displayed. That's an example of government regulation, right? And in an effort, in this case, the progressive effort to regulate, reform, and improve society. The Pure Food and Drug Act was another progressive legislation. And what this simply did is require drug companies to list their ingredients. The genesis of this today is when you look at a can or a package of food on the back, it tells you what is in that package. And you say, all right, well, why does that have to be regulated? Well, what if you have a certain allergy and you didn't realize that? One of the best examples I think of this today is that this product was produced in a plant that held nuts, right? That had peanuts or almonds. And so you might be buying potato chips, but if they have a peanut assembly line in the same room, your peanut allergy, you might die from that. And what is after that, you can't sue the company. So consumer protections, I want you to think about this, is a regulation of business and an effort to promote consumer protections can be seen in the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. Two other interesting progressive reforms led by Teddy Roosevelt was the creation of the U.S. Forest Service and the Conservation Act, the conservation movement, which meant to try to preserve the natural resources for the long term. So what if you're a logging company? I mean, really, in your interest is just cut down all the trees. Who cares? We're trying to make the money now. But what about in a generation or two generations? Should we be thinking in ways that improve our society? One of the most important kind of aspects under Teddy Roosevelt and at least the progressives was the creation of the Interstate Commerce Act, which tried to provide a regulation of businesses that extended beyond state lines. So a lot of state governments had tried to take on some of the powerful influences of trust, most famously the Standard Oil Trust. But even the state government had difficulty putting pressure on national and international companies. So by creating the Interstate Commerce Act, what this does is gives the federal government more influence over commerce that occurs from state to state. So this falls under the federal legislation. And one of the best examples of this is that we know of Teddy Roosevelt in the trust busting. What Teddy Roosevelt under the Hepburn Act and the Interstate Commerce Act tried to do is try to pressure trust that had become abusive. He said that he was not antitrust, but that he was anti-abusive trust. And one of the trusts that became the focal point was Standard Oil Trust and some of those aggressive business practices. Still, as we approach World War One, we see the continued influence of progressive presidents. We see the continued influence of progressives at the national level when it comes to Woodrow Wilson. Progressives at the national level, Woodrow Wilson's a great example of this too. Woodrow Wilson advocated for the 8-hour workday. He fought against the money trust, and on top of that, most importantly, is that he introduced the 16th Amendment. And the 16th Amendment, it was under his presidency that we started to tax Americans differently. Instead of based on property, we now shift to an income tax. This tells us a lot of the changing dynamics in the economic world. But one of the great parts of this tax code that would be implemented was a graduated tax code, which is that not everyone pays the same tax rate. People of higher incomes have a higher tax obligation than people who are in lower income brackets. What this is trying an example of is progressive thought is how can we take the tax code itself and regulate, reform, and improve it. These ideas were prevalent at the state and the national level and also found their way into the Supreme Court with one of the most famous progressives, Louis Brandeis. In 1914, he published The Other People's Money and How Bankers Use It, in which he attacked monopolies and the way investment bankers controlled American industry. And he said this: we must make our choice. We may have democracy or we may have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both. And so what you see is that he believed that the federal government could be a leveling tool, an equalizing tool in this democratic process. And he saw these trusts as these moneyed interests that were really impeding American democracy. And so at the federal level, you see continued reforms like the Federal Trade Commission and the Clayton Antitrust Act, again going back to the 16th Amendment and that graduated income tax. Other aspects of progressive legislation and reform can be seen in the emergence of factory inspection laws. Helen Starr from the Hull House was actually appointed to be Illinois' factory inspector chief. So you can see how urban reformers even infiltrated the state government. You see questions about whether or not workers who are injured on the job, if they should be deserve compensation. And so you see state governments passing rules about compensation of industrial accidents, minimum age for employment, or the elimination of child labor. But if you can reform the tax code, if you can reform politics, why can't you reform society? And the progressives thought that this was also possible. And one of the best examples of moral reform is that if we can legislate, one senator said, if we can legislate pure food and drugs, we can legislate pure morals. And in that now the temperance movement was not something new to the 20th century. It was very popular in the mid 1800s, but by the 20th century, the early 20th century, progressives had, gained enough momentum at all levels of government that the temperance movement, right, the elimination of alcohol sales, was seen as in a way of improving society. So if you made booze illegal, then you could promote good social behavior. And so you get on local levels and in state levels, you start to see the temperance movement come about. You think about this today, there are still dry counties throughout North Carolina where they do not sell liquor. They might sell beer, but they will not sell liquor. And this is the legacy of that old temperance movement reforming American society and morality. The temperance movement continued to gain steam. And by 1919, we saw this in the form of federal legislation. The 18th Amendment prohibited the sales, manufacture, and transportation of liquor, of intoxicating. Here's a little clip from the series Boardwalk Empire, which is set in the 1920s and will give us some context into the reason why alcohol was identified as a social issue that needed to be reformed and how the temperance movement could lead to progress.
Monster, vicious brute, friend to thief and prostitute, conscience dulled by demon rum, liquor, thy name's delirium. Tomorrow, we awaken to a new dawn. And on the eve of this momentous occasion, it is my pleasure to introduce Atlantic City's esteemed treasurer, the Honorable Enoch Thompson.
Mrs. McGarry, thank you for that stirring poem. Will you send me a copy? Ladies, years ago, there was a young boy who lived in this very city. The winter of '88, some of you remember, a blizzard of biblical proportions. The family was snowbound, freezing, without food or heat. The father vanished, laid to waste by alcohol. And so it was left to this boy, this little man of tender years, to fend for himself and his family. Off in the cold he went, worn shoes wrapped in rags, newspaper lining his thin wool coat, as he trudged chest deep in snow to the rail yard, foraging on hands and bloody knees for scraps of coal, hoping for some potatoes spilled from a ruptured sack. Finding none, he took a broom handle and in desperation killed his family's dinner. 3 wharf rats hiding in the hold of a ship. Terrible, yes, but the family survived. And the little boy? Well, the little boy speaks to you tonight from this very podium. Prohibition means progress. And never again will families be robbed of their fathers, held hostage by alcohol. And how proud I am to live in a nation which, God willing, this year will finally give its women the right to vote. Ladies, I regret to inform you that I've been called away on urgent county business and therefore will be unable to stay for the potluck. In closing, however, let me say this. Without the continued support of good, decent women like you, men like me would be nowhere. Thank you, and God bless.
It wasn't just alcohol that could be regulated, reformed in American society to uplift social morals, but also prize fighting came under the ire of progressives as a barbaric form of competition that boxing was like essentially an uncivilized sport. And so there was an attempt to eliminate prize fighting during the period. Now, one of the problems, though, when it comes to looking at the progressives during the time period is that other social issues crept into their interpretation of what was going on in society. Now, what we should really take our time to do is to focus on this point. Much of the progressive focus, really, and energy seemed to be a reaction to the changing aspects of society surrounding urbanization, industrialization, and this growing impersonal world that we talked about. So when you look around society and you see issues that you find problematic, sometimes we have a poor perspective of why those issues are there. We don't like it being in our society, but sometimes we don't have the best understanding of the roots of some of these issues. So when you go to look at efforts by the progressives to regulate alcohol, regulate prize fighting, or in the case of the Mann Act, which was a law that made it illegal to transport women across state lines, you can see that there's a lot of gray area and can be problematic when we are trying to regulate the morals of a society. For instance, the Mann Act was meant to try to reduce the sex slave trafficking market. But when you write legislation it made it illegal for immoral purposes, what is immoral becomes a big question. So what you saw is Jack Johnson, the first African-American heavyweight champion, was targeted by the Mann Act. And it looks like the evidence alludes that the real reason that he was targeted by this crime is because he was a black man who crossed the color line. He openly dated white women and, was achieving all this success. And so what was immoral there was the miscegenation between a black and a white woman. You can look on to later issues of Chuck Berry would be prosecuted under the Mann Act in the 1950s. Despite this optimistic review of the progressives, there were some shortcomings that their critics would point to. The social Darwinists of the world would likely say that the regulation reform efforts that these progressives put in place were either the natural evolution of society on its own or were failures. And they would also point to the negative consequences that they created in trying to fight that natural evolution. Good examples of this would be in the temperance movement, how by making alcohol illegal, it actually thrust alcohol sales into the black market and gave rise to organized crime and individuals like Al Capone. And would really have to, the 18th Amendment would have to be retracted so that now government regulation could be involved in alcohol sales. And likewise, I would guess that progressives would say the mistake here was making alcohol illegal completely. And here is how we can improve it by regulating it via government sales. Other shade that falls on the progressives comes to eugenics scandals and the idea that you can control society and even the biological development of society by regulating it in a way. And there are examples of where mentally ill people or people with learning disabilities were sterilized. And even North Carolina has a storied past in this discussion. So there are examples of where the progressive effort to improve society for the whole also does conflict with individual liberty and really challenges our ideas of variety in interpretations of what's socially and morally appropriate. And another example with this would be if we look towards racial issues during the Progressive Era. The Mann Act itself, which was a progressive effort to reduce the sex slave trafficking in early 20th century America, and some of those. If we look to the Mann Act, another example of the negative consequences or how the social outlook of a group can, really limit individual liberty. The Mann Act was a law that was passed that was intended to target the sex slave trafficking market. But because of the legislation was written in a very loose way, which it said it made it illegal to transport women across state lines for immoral purposes, this lent to an interpretation of what was immoral purposes. And you will see racial beliefs of the time creep into this, as Jack Johnson, the first African-American heavyweight champion, was targeted and charged with the Mann Act because he married a white woman and traveled across state lines. And what was immoral here, I guess, turns out to be that he was a black man married to a white woman. So the limitations and the shortcomings of progressivism would clearly be pointed out by the social Darwinists of the time, who would argue that in all their efforts to make society better, also had their hand in making it worse. There's a lot to think about when we think of the progressive era. What we first need to start with is industrialization and urbanization brought vast social changes that prompted Americans to reflect about the causes of these changes. Explanations to this changing world can be seen in the emergence of social Darwinism and literary movements towards realism and determinism. Progressivism appeared a refutation of these attitudes. Progressives were reformers who sought to improve their society through grassroots and government intervention. The muckrakers played a great role in focusing reform discussions, and these reform movements should be seen as a manifestation of the social gospel. And it was on a grassroots campaign led by urban reformers that eventually found allies in state and national politics that would affect these change. Most importantly for our discussion, I want you to see that the progressives were important in ushering in a vision where government was a useful tool in regulating, reforming, and improving society. The progressives were able to harness the power of the government in the early 20th century to implement these reform goals. And it was the reform goals were majorly focused on industrial society first, labor and business, but soon would be applied and extended to American views of morality.